and thank you all for joining us here today. This is going to be one whopper of a meeting. It's one that I hope they have several on. It is about to begin. The gavel's going down now. Don't forget to like and share. Facebook squeals on you if you don't. Major bills going to be heard here today. SB53, FB, SJR6, 7, and 5. All major constitutional amendments for taxes, PFD, giving us voter rights as Alaskans to decide on what the future is going to be. Also putting our statutory PFD underneath the formula in our Constitution so that way they can't keep using it to spend on government. Going to be interesting to hear what they have to say. This is going to be the first hearing of these bills.
Everybody, I'd like to call Senate State Affairs Committee to order. Today is Thursday, February 4, 2021. Let the record reflect the time is 3:33 p.m. Today we have President, Vice Chair, Senator Reinbold, Senator Costello, Senator Holland, Senator Kawasaki, myself, Chairman Schauer. Please go ahead and silence your cell phones for everybody in the room. Staff assisting us today, we've got Terrence Shanigan, Committee Aide for State Affairs, Carrie Cooper-Ryder with us from the records, and I don't know if it's not Nate. Alex, we had the wrong number. I knew that was wrong. So we've got Alex helping us from the LIO. You got it. We have two items on today's agenda. First will be SJR5. I know I was told the other day it's hard to hear me in this mass, so hopefully this is recording okay. Best you can hear it. I know it's kind of tough. Constitutional Amendment Appropriation Limit Budget reserved by Governor Dunleavy. The second is SJR7 Constitutional Amendment State Tax Voter Approval by Governor Dunleavy. Assisting the Governor's Office with the presentation of the constitutional amendments are going to be with us today in person will be Caroline Schultz from the Office of Management and Budget. And we have online with us, and I'll do a comm check here in a second, is Mike Barnhill from the Department of Revenue and Bill Milks from the Department of Law. Gentlemen, can you just verify you're with us?
Hello, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. This is Mike Barnhill, Deputy Commissioner for the Department of Revenue.
Thanks, and Bill?
And hello, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee. This is Bill Milks of the Department of Law.
Thanks, John. I just want to make sure we had you with us and we could hear you loud and clear. All right, before we get started, and I'll make a comment here on something else, are there any questions or comments from the committee members before we proceed with the first items on the agenda? Okay, looks like there are none there, but from my own perspective, I've been asked by several committee members if I would continue to highlight the fact on the bill that has caused lots of conversation, as we hoped it would, not all of it positive, but on SB39, election integrity, filed about a week and a half ago. I was asked to re-highlight the fact that we started working on this bill over 3 years ago, and filed the first version a little over 2 years ago. It was called SB116. And so this is not something that was related to this last election cycle a few months ago. The effort was started long before that. Matter of fact, as I have pointed out, interestingly, when we first did it in 2016, it was one half of the country was upset about the election results and didn't have faith in it. And this time around, the other half of the country is upset and doesn't have faith in it. So it should be political, across the board. Most people should be interested in finding ways to restore the faith of the electorate and making it as tight as we can. So that was the intent of the bill, but it has been filed and being worked on long before this last election cycle. So just for the record, as I was asked, I wanted to highlight that again. So with that, welcome to State Affairs. We've got presenting SJRs today. Are they be separately when do them or as a group?
Mr. Chairman, for the record, this is Caroline Schultz from the Office of Management and Budget. I'll be presenting on SJR5, the appropriation limit, and then I'll hand it over to Mike Barnhill, who will testify on SJR7.
Perfect, thank you. All right, and we've gone through the introductions already, so we're going to bypass that and get right into the presentation. And when you are ready, you may take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I am going to give a quick history on appropriation limits in Alaska. As you all know, Alaska already has a constitutional appropriation limit. It was first ratified by voters in 1982. That original provision had a sunset clause, if you will, and it meant that it had to go before voters again in 1986, and for a second time voters, with considerable regard, re-approved the constitutional appropriation limit. I say this to point out that constitutional appropriation limits and the concept of spending limits in general are very popular by Alaskans. You also may know that we have a statutory spending limit. This was also enacted in 1986. Along with the statutory spending limit, the legislature enacted the Statutory Budget Reserve, which was one of our rainy day savings accounts. In 1990, voters of Alaska ratified the Constitutional Budget Reserve, which is Article 9, Section 17. So I just wanted to give some background. So I'm going to give a brief overview of what SJR5 does to start out. SJR5 amends Article 9, Section 16 of the Alaska Constitution, and this is the section on the appropriation limit. The most important thing that SJR5 does is that it amends the appropriation limit calculation. It changes the math behind how we calculate the appropriation limit. Essentially, it's that the state spending cannot exceed the prior 3-year average by more than either the greater of population or inflation growth. It also clarifies what's defined by the appropriation limit. It includes all state spending, which means UGF and DGF, and it clarifies the exceptions. That's the PFD, bond proceeds and debt service costs, deposits to state savings accounts, disaster response, and non-state funds, like federal funds or other funds that are received by the state for a specific purpose.
Okay, and I'll make it clear, since we're going through this pretty quick in the presentation, and I apologize, I should have said up front, if you have a specific question, we'll stop and let her answer so we don't have to circle back too far. So, Senator Reinbold.
Thank you. This is the first time, obviously, hearing the bill, and welcome to the committee. This is cool. I just wanted to ask you, this is kind of important, so the disaster relief money is not included.
Well, I owe you donuts next time. That's my bad.
Senator Reinbold, through the chair, disaster response, if it is in response to a state disaster as declared by our disaster statutes, that fund would not be included in the appropriation limit, whether it's federal or state funds.
And through the chair, one more.
Go
Do you have
ahead.
any idea how much funds? I believe Senator Von Hemop said somewhere around $5 billion has been brought into the state since March. So that would be excluded. Is that correct? Thank you.
Vice Chair Reinbold, I can get you that exact number, follow up to the committee, certainly. First of all, I want to clarify that federal funds, for the most part, regardless of whether it's for a disaster or not, would not be counted under the cap. So whether it's federal disaster funds, federal funds for highways, federal funds for Medicaid, that wouldn't count toward the cap as it is currently written. State funds expended on a disaster would also not count toward the cap.
It's the disaster response.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good. Thank you. Please continue, Karen.
The second part of SJR5 amends Article 9, Section 17, and that's the part about the Constitutional Budget Reserve, or the CBR, as we call it. It changes how we access, or how the legislature accesses the CBR. It gets rid of the 3/4 vote requirements, and it says that appropriations from the CBR can be made by a majority vote if there are inadequate revenues to meet general fund expenditures. This provision also removes the general fund liability to the CBR, which we often call the CBR sweep provision.
Would you be able to, if you would, at this point, because this becomes pretty significant in the budget process, you were around for that for several years, that at times can be very contentious here. So what, excuse me, is the intention behind changing things that would be significant to how we do business in the legislature? What is the governor's intent by changing those two provisions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly. The CBR, as currently drafted in the Constitution, has different gates for access. And the first gate is one that we almost never employ, and it says that if the amount available for appropriation is insufficient to meet your budget, as long as your budget is smaller than the prior year, you can access the CBR with a majority vote. An important court case in 1994, Hickel versus Cooper, decided that the amount in the Permanent Fund Earnings Reserve counts as available for appropriation. And of course, that's, at this point, billions of dollars. So we actually never get to qualify for that majority vote provision to access the CBR for kind of a traditional rainy day fund. So that always toggles us over to that 3/4 vote rule, which is an appropriation from the CBR for any state purpose. The current CBR language also has a provision that requires that at the end of the fiscal year, if the state has made expenditures from the CBR, the state has to pay that back. So at the end of fiscal year 20, we have approximately a $10 billion liability to the CBR, plus or minus. So this would change it so we don't have to pay back that $10 billion. We don't have to get the 3/4 vote access, and we don't have to deal with that year-end, essentially a political problem that's the reverse sweep.
Both of these become a political problem, which is it's fascinating, and I'm sure there will be many other questions and debate on this one, but that is a significant change, which is why I was asking perhaps what the intent was, because it could add some politics, it could remove some politics, it could make some things easier, might make some things harder. So that is something that's going to have to be carefully considered by this body, because that will make some significant changes. Okay, thank you. Please continue.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that's a really astute point, and really the idea here is to make the CBR a traditional rainy day account. I'm going to move on to some modeling that shows kind of quantitatively what this spending cap would look like. I think this is obviously something that I'm more excited about talking about the modeling than the Constitution. I'm an economist, not a lawyer, so bear with me. What I first want to talk about is I want to just point out to the committee how the current appropriation limit, as it is articulated in the Constitution today, is just ineffective. And I know all members are already familiar with this idea, and you can see here on the graph that goes back to 1982, when the current constitutional amendment was approved by voters. It's that thick, dark line that just grows, just kind of beyond the scope of either state revenue or state general fund expenditures. So you can see that only really in 2 years did we even have revenue that matched our current cap, and we've actually never approached with our unrestricted general fund spending. So it's clearly ineffective. That being said, I mentioned that voters approved the cap back in approved it for a second time back in the 80s, and even then it was already kind of borderline. There was an awareness at that point that it wasn't working. So it's still a popular concept. We just need to fine-tune the math.
Another question, just for a moment. At least several of the members here were going through this pretty much the same bill 2 years ago, so a little bit deja vu for us, but we worked on this significantly. One of the questions that came up was not just tying it, I know we're going to talk about it in a minute, but so I'm skipping slightly ahead because it kind of relates to this, was not just tying it to CPI or inflation in some measure moving forward, but also looking at revenue. Was that considered in the process of this? And if it was not included, because it doesn't appear to be, why not revenue and not just inflationary factors driven into the formula?
Mr. Chairman, that's a really important policy question, and I agree that that's something the committee should consider very carefully. The attempt with this version was to keep it essentially as close to the SJR that was introduced 2 years ago, but just kind of clean it up and tighten the language up a bit.
I just wanted to something to consider this time, where you guys just kind of, it sounds like you're just moving from okay, got it,
Yeah,
thank you.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rumble.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I just want to make sure I heard you right, because this actually, I was not expecting to hear you say this. So please correct me if I'm incorrect. So right now you say we have about a $10 billion liability to the CBR. Is that correct? And you're recommending that we don't pay that back?
Vice Chair Reinbold, that's correct. Based on the fiscal year 2020 CAFR, the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report for the state, our liability to the CBR is about $10 billion. That'll get audited and maybe refined, but yes, this does propose removing that liability.
Through the chair.
Go ahead.
So my opinion, it was overspending, and so pretending that this is a cap when really it allows to erase a bunch of overspending is really not the right impression for this bill. I mean, I kind of like the liability in regards to tightening the budgets down and having to pay that back. And I'm going to step on and move on and to talk about the 3/4 vote. Sometimes it's really a big deal, and the reverse sweep. And so, Mr. Chairman, thank you for bringing that up. But this is really creating a completely different environment legislatively. And so I actually think that I would prefer the legislative body to be talking about this rather than the executive branch directing it. And I know I don't, but because I had a budget cap thing way back like 6 or 7 years ago when I voted no on the budget. And so anyway, it just feel like I'm being managed by the administration, and it's just not setting well with me. Not that I want an honest spending cap and responsible spending, but the way so far it's already causing me pretty significant pause. But Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Ramble, that's why we're here, to debate this and figure out what the answers are. It may ultimately not survive, or it may change dramatically. We certainly changed it 2 years ago pretty significantly. Open to that. Senator Costello, you had questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. My question has to do with the $10 billion liability, and how does that, or does it affect our bond rating?
Through the chair, Senator Costello, I would have to get back to you with a response from after talking to our bond manager.
Okay, thank you. And follow up, Mr.
Before you do that, just in case, we have your lifelines here. They may be able to answer some of those questions. So if you want to call on them, we certainly can, if you think they can answer the question or might be able to. They may not. I'm just asking if you want to call them out.
Deputy Commissioner Barnhill might have thoughts on the subject.
Okay, and I just want to, if there's a good question that they can answer, they certainly don't have to be quiet because they're not presenting. So, gentlemen, do one of you have a thought on Senator Costello's question about the bond rating?
Through the chair, Senator Costello, this is Mike Barnhill, Deputy Commissioner, Department of Revenue. This is an obligation that we owe to ourselves. I don't believe that it's taken into account by ratings agencies, but I would like to confirm that with our debt manager, Mr. Devin Mitchell, and come back to the committee.
Okay, thank you. Senator Costello, follow-up?
Yeah, and my follow-up question actually is a separate question related to the CBR three-quarter vote. And is it possible for the administration to look back and grab some, and let us know how much the budget has grown to sort of get that three-quarter vote? I know that we've had some special sessions and what have you where to have that kind of a super majority, individuals have said, well, I can go for that as long as I get this project or that or whatever. Is that something that you can do and give the committee some information on how having a three-quarter vote has actually expanded, or in fact, in some cases, maybe it has reduced government spend?
Through the chair, Senator Costello, I can certainly try. I believe any kind of analysis like that will require a level of subjectivity, and maybe some, kind of offline phone calls with some former co-chairs, but we certainly can try.
So do you want to get back to us on that one, or?
Yeah, I'm not prepared to speculate right now, but yeah, I'm happy to get back to the committee.
It's a very germane question, which is why I brought up the politics of it. It could be significant effects, which is exactly what Senator Costello is asking. We're all going to go, wait a minute, that's quite a bit different. Which way would this go? Okay, fair enough. Is that okay, Senator Costello? See if we can get some analysis and thoughts on it. We certainly ask. Thank you. Please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back to this committee. I know in these you have all seen this graph before. I want to point out that for those watching at home, that the green line represents our unrestricted general fund revenue, and the orange line is our unrestricted general fund spending. I do want to make one fine point on this, is that while I'm modeling UGF spending, the appropriation limit does apply to a broader definition of state spending than just UGF, but for the purposes of historical look back and ease of presentation, I do use UGF as a proxy for state spending. But when it comes down to the finer points, when we're looking short term within a 3-year time frame, we will use the actual amount that is defined under the appropriation limit. So I just want to clarify that point. So the dotted line on this graph shows what if in 1982, instead of choosing that $2.5 billion starting point and then letting it grow with both inflation and population, what if the voters had approved SJR5 as written today? You can see that black dotted line would have been the spending cap. If we were going to do revisionist history, that's what it would have looked like going back to 1982. About $35 billion of unrestricted general funds wouldn't have been spent if SJR5 had gone into effect in 1982. Whether we put those funds in our other savings accounts, in the CBR, in the SBR, obviously any of us can imagine. If we had put $35 billion in the permanent fund over that time period, we'd have $100 billion in the fund, and our PUMV would be enough to cover our structural deficit.
So, are you done there? I have a comment. I think more than anything else, I'm fascinated by this intersection of the lines. Because one of the questions I have consistently asked from a finance or a budgetary perspective is, if you go back to 2006, which matches the chart, our UGF size of the government, using that as the baseline, was about, not quite, but about half of what it is today. In other words, we've nearly doubled when you look at the spend and where we are. So you can see where the lines kind of intersect up there. So it matches perfectly when you think about when we should have done something and did not. And the question becomes, why did we grow government so fast to the point that today when revenue becomes an issue, now we can't sustain it and we're having to make these hard choices? So it matches up perfectly with what we did. And I say we, responsible citizens, legislatures, governors, all that, whatever. We're all collectively responsible. We did this to ourselves. And you can see it right there in that chart. And we did not cap ourselves appropriately. And had we done so, we would not be sitting in this boat today. And I say that to make this point. If we don't do it today and make the hard choices, what you see on that chart for the last 14 years is exactly where we're going to be for the next 14 years if we don't do something about it and keep ourselves in check, because clearly we can't on our own. So I just want to highlight that, because when you go back to data, I want to show that this is a problem that we have created for ourselves. And you can even look at the spend and how it matches. When revenue came up, we spent the money. When it went down, we had to drop it down. But look where we would be today if we had not gone through that and what we would have saved. I think that's an important point for the public to understand, because this gets lost in the conversation of how much money we have, federal, these kinds of things. And boy, you can look at the chart and it can tell you that picture is worth 1,000 words. So Senator Kawasaki, I'm sure you want to comment.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Carolyn, can you tell me in fiscal year 2008, 9, 10, the big spikes there, how much of that was capital spending versus operating expense?
Through the chair, Senator Kawasaki, I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head, but we had over $1 billion UGF capital budgets in that era. So yes, a considerable driver of UGF spend during that period was increased spending on capital. There was an increased spending in the operating budget as well, but the majority of that increase was driven by capital expenditures.
I'm going to add one more. You may have a follow-up, but real quick to that as well. To be fair, because I'm not trying to make a lopsided argument. There was the capital spend, which was a lot of what we reduced in spending to get ourselves back to as things dropped off with revenue. But also, there was about a $3 billion, as I remember, payment to PERS and TERS to bring it down too. So some of that shows those increases. That's just shaking their head no. So was it less than that? There's a lifeline, not here for testimony. But I know there was significant payments to that as well, trying to catch it up, that I remember coming out of the finance table. So some of that spend, but I go back to, where we sat and how we did that, we would have had better options, an opinion of why we need a cap. I'm sorry, Senator Kawasaki, did I get a follow-up?
No, maybe if we could just get through the chair something that shows us basically like the operating expenses, because I think those need to be recognized. And then the other thing, just a statement more to make than anything else, is that those big capital spend years where we have those spikes, they were to fill potholes that we hadn't done for 20 years, and they were to improve. When we talk about the billions of dollars that we have, that we owe to the Constitutional Budget Reserve, which I agree with 100%. We also have deferred maintenance in the billions of dollars that we are not currently taking care of in our normal maintenance and operation budget, and so I think that also needs to be a recognition that there are some big years, and some of those big years were just to catch up for all those other years that we didn't.
And to be quite frank, Senator Kawasaki, I don't disagree with you. I'm trying, like all of us, to figure out how we balance the books now and make it work. But this is why the point I'm trying to make is that a spending cap that was viable, that would have held us in check in those other years, as I'm just going to say Carolyn, just because it's easier, was pointing out, we would have had a lot more money in the bank now, perhaps, had we constrained ourselves and not done that. So your points are valid, and I'm not saying that we have to. It's one of the problems we're facing right now, let's be frank. Minimum capital budgets, and we're getting further behind. There's no doubt. So how do we balance the books? Is that we still have to pay the bills, bottom line. So if you could get that data so we can get that to the committee, that would be helpful. Thank you for that. And Senator Ramble, and then we're going to have her continue.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm going to echo off some of the things that Senator Kawasaki and both Mr. Chairman said. First of all, I'm going to state my opinion. The governor has about 95% of the budget. We have about 2%. The court's about 3%. He has whatever cap he wants. In all fairness, it's ridiculous that how much he campaigned on cutting the budget, and I just can't wait to get the total dollars that he spent, because I'm certainly not saying what he preached. So, I have to get that on the record. That's really a big deal to me. And in regards to the maintenance and deferred maintenance issue, I saw it when I was in my subcommittees, they weren't using it. We were giving it to them as deferred maintenance, and they were using it for supplemental employees. And we tried to correct this over and over and over again. They didn't do it. The multiple administrations, doesn't matter if they're Republican, Democrat, Independent, doesn't matter. They were all abusing the deferred maintenance. And so as much as I want the buildings taken care of and the assets we have either taken care of or sold, because I tried to sell a couple buildings in my amendments, we have a lot of buildings. You know, the bottom line is the administration is the bottom line. They need to be held accountable for excessive bloated budgets and not using the funds, you know, that we gave them for certain specific things. So just need to get that on the record.
Okay, we'll continue because we want to get through and we have another presentation. Definitely there's work to do and room on all sides. So please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This next slide, I know it has a lot of lines on it, and I'll definitely take the time to walk the committee through what we're looking at here. Again, just kind of in the background, there's the green line for UGF revenue and the orange line for UGF expenditures. I've taken a little bit of a zoomed in look here. We're only looking at fiscal year 2000 through fiscal year 2022, the next budget year. What I wanted to show is that one of the really positive aspects about using that 3-year rolling average is that your spending cap can adjust. And so what I've modeled here with the various blue lines is, again, that kind of retrospective notion, like what if we had implemented SJR5 then? What would the spending cap have looked like? And so, you know, starting from the left-hand side of the graph, you can see there's the light blue line. If we had started it in fiscal year 2000, which was still during a period of fairly constrained spending, you know, it follows along it's a linear progression with some growth for inflation and population, the greater of. And I would like to make a point to the committee, based on our recent history in Alaska, inflation has been a higher growth factor than population. Again,
just to be clear, it's actually decreasing right now. I believe 3 years running.
Yes, Mr.
We have a net outflow of people from the state.
That's correct. Again, if we implemented SJR5 in fiscal year 2005, you know, tracks right along with this 2000 line. Okay, but what if we implemented SJR5 during a period of higher spending? You can see if we had started in 2010, you know, that higher period of budget growth does allow for a larger spending cap than the one that would have started in 2005, but you can see that it adjusts down. Same with 2015. You know, it starts at a very high level because it's factoring in those prior record budget years into its 3-year average, but it drops down. It tapers to meet the fiscal reality of the situation. And I think that's a really important notion when you're considering what calculation to use. Something that auto-corrects versus something like, you can see the current Article 9, Section 17 or 16 limit, it just grows and grows and grows.
Before you move on, I'm going to, excuse me, I don't know why I'm having a problem with that today. I feel like I've swallowed the frog, as the saying goes. So if you were to include, if you could briefly talk to, because we did, revenue that was available as opposed to spending either one or the other or some kind of a combination for the public, how would that affect us? Because it can be different based on what we decide to spend and what's available to spend. So how might that work? If you've not war gamed it, that's fine. We can talk later, but if you haven't, I'd like to get the data. If you could speak to it now, that's fine as well.
Mr. Chairman, yeah, including revenue, and it does depend on how you do it, of course, how you weight that factor. It can mean that your spending limit calculation is more nimble and responsive to changing environment, but during periods of high revenue spikes, that can allow your spending cap to grow more quickly than your spending, than it would if it were just based on spending alone. I'm not going to necessarily make a value judgment as to whether that's good or bad. It's just a consideration. And I'm happy to provide some more graphs.
We can certainly talk about it. I bring it up because, again, it was part of the discussion we had 2 years ago. We're having the same discussions again about whether it's better to have it as revenue, whether it's tied to like CPI inflation, or some combination. And I look at that as the chart, and you see, wow, look at that green line. Boy, would that spike spending, or, you know, the limit itself, and what would that reflect for us and our ability to use it and how we might use it, right? So I just don't want that to be dropped out of the discussion, because I think that's very important, and a lot of people are calling for one that's based on revenue or a combination. So I think it's something that we need to have. Again, the whole debate, all sides need to get a chance to hack at this and see what they think about how this works, but there are pros and cons to most approaches. Again, if you could maybe when you talk to others, if we could kind of have that included as a thought process as well, because we're going to debate that, and I don't want to leave that off the table. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chairman. Yeah, if we come back and visit the committee again on this topic, happy to provide more information with that.
Senator Kawasaki.
Yeah, just a really quick question. Do these graphs include the permanent fund dividend that's paid out annually?
Through the chair, thank you, Senator Kawasaki. No, the UGF spending does not include the permanent fund dividend, and I didn't include that because the permanent fund dividend is not subject to the appropriation limit, so I didn't include it here in that orange line.
Okay, thank you.
It's a good question. Thank you. And also, it would be interesting because in 2017 we changed the language, so we made it a government expense. So it would get a little wonky, I think, in there, anyways, perhaps from what it was till now. So, anyways, thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, the way that this is drafted does specifically clarify that the appropriation for the permanent fund dividend, regardless of where it is, would be excluded from the cap.
It would just be an interesting line to see. Thank you.
Well, and this is my last graph for the committee today, and this one is forward-looking. So again, I know a lot of lines, so I'll definitely take the time to walk through these for the committee and for people watching at home. We have the big dashes is the green line. I probably should have made those different colors now that we're all here, but consideration for next time. The modest looking green line is the official Department of Revenue forecast for oil and POMB draw revenue. And the orange dotted line is the OMB official 10-year plan budget forecast. So those, because we base those on, the OMB forecast is based on some assumed reductions in the next couple of fiscal years and then an inflation factor, and the DOR forecast, of course, is so heavily based on the POMV draw. Those are both fairly stable growth factors. The small dotted line that's a little bit more volatile is kind of what if revenue grew tomorrow like it had during that period between 2005 and 2011 when we had those big swings in revenue. What I really want to draw committee members' attention to are the solid lines. So the gray solid line that tracks with UGF spending, that's if we enacted SJR5 for fiscal year 2023, that's what the cap would do if spending followed the OMB 10-year plan. So you can see, of course, naturally they converge. That makes sense. The black thick line is what would SJR5 look like if we maximized our spend to the cap. So, and I want to highlight this because I don't want to create the notion that SJR5 is overly limiting on spending or doesn't allow for responsiveness. You can see that that top line, that kind of like the highest possible cap based on normal inflation and population measures, it's higher than our projected revenue. And if revenue were to increase in a year, we would be able to appropriate, more than we might necessarily otherwise.
Okay. I would also highlight again, go back to several things from 2 years ago when we had made some amendments to this provision. One of the things we did was provide, I believe, and Senator Kawasaki can remind me, I think I got the language right, it was a waterfall fund, so that when we had excess years, if we had high revenue, that over and beyond the cap, not from operating expenses, but for capital to help us catch up. I think we had like $500 million, so about $500 million, if it was available to use in that, so that we could catch up with federal funds to expand infrastructure projects, something I think we'd want to look at considering again for this, because I think everybody's concerned about our infrastructure. So, but how do we do that without, putting ourselves into a hole again? So, okay, thank you. That's not included in here clearly, but that's something I would also ask if you could start maybe thinking about that too, how that might work, and we can certainly talk about, how we did that before.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and I am familiar with the work that this committee did on the previous joint resolution, and yes, while this specifically isn't drafted to specify where revenue beyond the cap would be directed, that's definitely an important policy conversation for this committee to have. Absolutely,
and it's just one of those things I would ask as we get to that, perhaps having more graphs and some product that we can use to kind of help us gauge how that might play out and where it would be appropriate.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, and I'm happy to work with committee members and staff, outside committee and look at the modeling and look at the spreadsheets anytime. So,
you bet. Thank you.
If there aren't any other questions for me, I will turn it over to Deputy Commissioner Barnhill. I'm going to sit here and drive the PowerPoint, but we can hear about SJR7.
Okay, so just beforehand, are there any questions for Caroline on SJR5 before we move on? All right, we're missing a member. We'll go ahead and continue. Please put yourself back in the record, gentlemen, and we'll start with SJR7.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And for the record, this is Mike Barnhill, Deputy Commissioner for the Department of Revenue. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for taking up SJR7 today. This vehicle is very similar to a measure that was considered by this committee 2 years ago. That was SJR4. It's very simple in its construction, easy to explain, lots of interesting policy questions that come from it. I suspect we'll spend most of our time talking about the policy questions. In short, what SJR7 does is amend Article 9 of the Alaska Constitution, Section 1, to add a requirement for voter approval of any new tax enacted by the legislature. This SJR7 is a little bit different than SJR4 from 2 years ago, in that what we had before the committee 2 years ago was a requirement for voter approval for any new tax enacted by the legislature and any tax increase enacted by the legislature. This time around, we're just narrowing it to any new tax. As the committee knows, Alaska has already in the Constitution two forms of direct democracy. That is the people's power of initiative, so the people have the power to initiate laws directly, and the people's power of referendum. The people have the power to repeal laws enacted by the legislature. So what we've done is essentially add a new form of direct democracy to the Alaska Constitution, and functionally it authorizes an automatic referendum on new taxes. The people have the power now to initiate a referendum to repeal a tax measure enacted by the legislature, and in fact that was done with respect to SB21. This puts it into the Constitution, so it's automatic. The second part of SJR7 is a balancing measure, and that is for any new tax initiated by the people, the legislature has the power of approval. And so what would happen is if there was an initiative that enacted a new tax, the legislature would have to take that matter up in joint session and approve it by a majority vote. This is different than direct democracy. It's functionally a form of checks and balances. So with these two new subsections in the Constitution, we basically create a partnership of the people and the legislature with respect to the enactment of any new tax. And I'll pause there for questions on this slide.
One quick one. Actually, Senator Costello, go ahead. I'll hold my question.
Thank you, Mike, for your explanation. So my question has to do with the majority vote. You said in a joint session, would that be 31 votes, not taking into account the different bodies, or would it be 11 and 21? So a majority of each of the bodies.
Through the chair, Senator Costello, the way I read it, it is 31 votes, a majority vote of the joint session.
Senator Costello, follow up? Not yet. Senator Reinbold?
With all due respect, Mike Barnhill, you know how much I respect you. I think you bring amazing talent to the table, as with Carolyn. Thank you, you guys. Immense respect for both of you. I'm just going to put something on record just after first blush. A representative republic is what we are. And again, I can't help but say this feels like it's transforming into a democracy. As much as I don't like new taxes, I think people elect people to handle that. And they don't understand the whole budget and all that. So as much as I don't like taxes, I, once again, feel like this administration is trying to tie our hands and reduce the power of the legislature. And this is very frustrating to hear right now, even though, Mike, like I said, thank you for being here today. You're delivering a tough message, but we are representative Republican. I'm going to fight to defend that at this time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Senator Ramble. The question when you read it, Mike, is would this be something that can be interpreted to apply to any initiative moving forward? Because it seems just, I mean, the way it is written, and I will tell you the section here real quick, or I can go to it, it's the last paragraph roughly, that says that, you know, this is something that basically the legislature can override the will of the people for initiative. Is that going to be written in a way, or is it interpreted in a way that it is only applicable to this provision for a tax increase that is voted upon? And or can this be something that our judiciary, without legislative intent, because we've had some conflicts there, can come in and say that applies to any initiative? So I have a bit of a concern of how this might be interpreted.
Mr. Chair, thank you for that question. So I'll draw the committee's attention to page 2 of the resolution, line 7.
Give me one second.
That
hold on one second.
An initiative that establishes a state tax. And so this is confined as simply an initiative that creates a new state tax. That's what triggers the legislature's ability in joint session to take it up and approve it by majority vote.
Okay. I'm not a lawyer, just like some of the others here. That seems like I have concerns. I will ask those questions and I will try to get them answered for how that might be interpreted. So I understand your point, and like Senator Reinbold said, just I know you're the messenger, so we're going to take a little harder look at that one to make sure that that's not something that could go away. We don't anticipate, because like I said, often we've seen legislative intent, and I suppose in this case even the governor's intent, if you want to say that, might not necessarily pan out the way we think it does. So thank you for that. We'll get back to it. We'll do our own deep dive and ask more questions later. Please continue.
Sure, and Mr. Chair, I appreciate the comments. And of course, we have Mr. Milks online, our legal expert in this area, and he can also weigh in. We'll get to him in a few moments, and he's going to step the committee through a sectional, and he can provide a more detailed answer. If I could, Mr. Chair, before I proceed, and with all due respect to Senator Reinbold, I completely appreciate the fact that we're a representative democracy. The interesting thing about Alaska and several states is that by Constitution, we've added these direct democracy elements to our representative democracy, and that was the case since the beginning of statehood. The framers in 1955 thought it was important for the people to have the ability to have the initiative as well as the referendum. And so I would agree that in a state that doesn't have those elements of direct democracy already hardwired into the Constitution from the inception of the statehood, it would be more of a reach. But in Alaska, since that's been part of our legal heritage from the very beginning, truly what we've done here, what the governor is proposing here, is simply automating a referendum in the sole instance of legislative enactment of a new tax. Mr. Chair, I'll proceed on to slide number 7, which is a little bit of background. And so there are a handful, it's not a lot, but a handful of other states that have similar constitutional provisions. And I'll just step through those. And actually, there's one state that I left off, but I can provide more details about that later. So Colorado in 1992 amended its constitution to add what's called colloquially the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, or TABOR. If you ever hear about folks talking about TABOR, that's functionally what we have here. The combination of SJR5 and SJR7 is functionally what Colorado did in 1992. And there it's a little broader, more similar to what we had 2 years ago in SJR4. Voter approval for any new tax and any increase to existing taxes at both the state and local level. And that's another distinction here. We're just talking about the state level. In Colorado, it applies to the local level as well. The experience of Colorado is that it does provide a check on legislative enactment of taxes and increases in taxes, but Colorado has approved taxes under its TABOR provision, most notably a marijuana tax approved by the voters in 2013. and certain tobacco tax increases just last year in 2020.
And can you hold on for a second there, Mike? Senator Costello has a question.
Oh, thank you. Mike, I was just curious if you have a definition of tax.
Through the chair, Senator Costello. So tax, as I understand it, is a word that is already used in the Alaska Constitution, and so it's not a new concept we are introducing into the Constitution. Milks has a fairly precise legal definition of tax, but from a policy perspective, from the Department of Revenue's view, a tax includes a broad-based sales tax, a broad-based income tax, an excise tax. So the legislature has enacted here's for a number of taxes. They call them taxes. All of those would be considered taxes under the Constitution. It does not include user fees. And user fees are like fees that you pay when you go to a court filing, for instance, that is tied to a specific service that is done by a state agency to defray the cost of that service. Anything beyond that, I'm going to punt to Mr. Milks and happy to have him chime in at this point if that's okay, Mr. Chair.
Stand by a second. Go ahead, Senator.
Mike, so I'm wondering, would a reduction in the permanent fund dividend be considered a tax?
Through the chair, Senator Costello, I believe the answer to that is no.
Thank you. That was what I was...
Do you want Mr. Milks to answer?
If he knows the answer to that question.
Mr. Milks, if you have some thoughts, we're all ears.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Costello. I do think Mr. Barnhill sort of outlined it pretty well. You know, we do have the word tax in the Alaska Constitution, and so the framers put that word in there, and we're not, and so this amendment would continue to use that word. I think all the examples Mr. Barnhill used fit a basic definition of tax. You know, when we try to interpret words in the Alaska Constitution, we look back at what the words meant when the framers put them in the Constitution, and you know, there's a basic definition that the framers were aware of from the dictionaries at that time, which is basically a tax meaning a charge laid down by the government on persons or property for a public purpose. I think Ms. Barnhill has identified several examples, and in contrast, there are things called user fees. I think Mr. Barnhill referred to a specific example, but things like fishing, hunting licenses are examples of user fees, which would not reasonably be considered a tax. So with that, I'll send it back to Mr. Barnhill.
Okay, we're over to Senator Kawasaki had a question.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe Mr. Barnhill can answer this, or Mr. Milks. So just to get back on the question, I don't know if we're going down a rabbit's hole on what a tax is, but so when I was on a city council many years ago, we had basically our property taxes had paid for the garbage utility in the city of Fairbanks, and then they decided to make it a fee because we had a revenue cap. So it became something that was outside of the cap because it was considered a fee. And we had the vigorous debate about it, because you actually, if you're a resident within the city of Fairbanks, you have to get garbage utility. Or if you're an apartment complex of more than 4, you can contract out to one of these private vendors. So under that circumstances, that really is it a fee, or is it a hidden tax, I guess?
Through the chair, Senator Kawasaki, it's difficult to sort of give prospective legal advice on specific situations. I will say from a policy perspective, and I'll defer to Mr. Milks, That sounds more like a fee than a tax. Again, it sounds like something that's tied to a specific function, and the purpose is to defray the cost of that function alone, which seems different than revenue raised more broadly for the purpose of funding public services in general. But I can see that in that particular context, arguments could go both ways, and that's why we are kind of reluctant to say, okay, you know, in that specific situation, that's definitely one or the other. But I'll now defer to Mr. Milks to clean up whatever milk I just spilled.
Is that good?
Yes, through the chair, Senator Kawasaki. You know, again, I think Mr. Barnhill gave a reasonable explanation, but I think it's difficult to assess. Like, I think in that example, you were talking about a local government, and local governments they do have things like special assessments to pay for certain local improvements and things, which are different than, I think, under the Alaska Constitution Article 9, Section 1, which is focused on a state tax. I don't have anything further on that.
So, yeah, just a quick follow-up. So, okay, let's say the Division of Motor Vehicles, that's well-known within the state, that it actually makes more money than it actually expends to do the positions, to pay for the positions, to pay for the materials, to pay for the license plates, those types of things. What if we were just to raise that amount a lot, or an exorbitant amount that more than pays for the facility itself? I mean, I guess that the extra money that goes to Department of Administration and the DMV probably gets spent somewhere in general fund. So if we were to increase it past where it made money, would that be considered a tax? Again, I think that we're getting down a weird rabbit trail, but I just had the question.
Mr. Chair, Senator Kawasaki, Mike Barnhill for the record. It's a super interesting hypothetical, and I think with respect, I think it's going to be difficult to say categorically that it's one or the other in that situation.
Okay, I'm good with that.
Through the chair, Senator Kawasaki, again, I guess I would agree with Mr. Barnhill, and I think there when there's questions under the Alaska Constitution, the Alaska Supreme Court, has been pretty consistent on what they're looking at. They're looking at like a plain meaning of a constitutional provision, a reasonable one, a common sense one. So it's sort of hard to deal with some of the hypotheticals. But I think what you're pointing out is that it wouldn't always be the case that just a label would control. If you get something that was in effect looking an awful lot like a tax to a court, they could consider that to be a tax. But I think we go back to, we've had the word tax in the Alaska Constitution since it was enacted. The framers were applying a practical, reasonable definition of it, about a charge by the government for a public purpose to meet the public needs of the government. I think Mr. Barnhill's given a few examples that are very, very clear. So I believe you mentioned things like sales or income taxes, not user fees.
Senator Rambo, do you have a question or a comment?
I do. Mr. Chairman, and this would be, I guess, to anybody who wants to answer this, how does this resolution answer to the Constitution when it says, this is Article 9, Section 1, taxing power. The power of taxation shall never be surrendered. This power shall not be suspended or contracted away except as provided by this article. Not that I'm a fan of taxation, but we're not allowed to do anything unconstitutional. And so I'm just trying to rectify how this works.
So, Mike Barnhill for the record, through the chair, Senator Reinbold. Of course, what we're doing here is amending the Constitution, and so this would fall under the existing words, except as provided in this article.
Yeah, and Senator Ramble's asking for a little bit more explanation. I think what you're trying to drive, if I'm not wrong, is that because we're amending the Constitution, it would then be constitutional, correct?
Correct.
I'm not making fun of it. I mean, if there's more explanation, feel free, but I think that's his point.
Well,
So.
I guess what I'm trying to decide, if you're not allowing it, but allowing it in the same sentence, does that really make sense? If it says the power of taxation shall not be surrendered, and then we're going to surrender it, I mean, it just doesn't rectify my mind. But I just need a lawyer or somebody to tell me that you can have a double negative or a double, in the same sentence.
No, I really wasn't trying to make light of it. I think the question is germane, and Bill, probably best for you to answer, is because the way this bill is written that it's going to change the Constitution, I guess you have to write it that way before it's changed to be considered legal by the court. So can you give a more precise legal definition of the process when you do that? Because obviously if you can't write it in there, then you can't make the change. I know it's almost the chicken or the egg, but can you give the legal term for that?
Yes, Mr. Chair, sure. I mean, I do think what is the Constitution says what it says right now. The people have the right to amend it. So that constitutional provision would include the language that it currently does about power of taxation shall never be surrendered. And then it goes on to say this power should not be suspended or contracted away except as provided in this article. And now this article will go on to add 2 new subsections that will address the really sort of a separate issue, which is the question of establishing a new state tax.
Go ahead, Senator.
One more time. Okay, so I'm gonna ask you to read how the new Constitution would exactly say, because right now it says the power of taxation shall never be surrendered, period. This power shall not be suspended or contracted away except as provided in this article. So can you finish that sentence?
Through the chair, it's Bill Milkskin from the Department of Law. So that's the word, Senator Reinbold, I would direct you to the SJR7. Then it would pick up at page 1, line 9, and then going forward. It would provide that this Article 9, Section 1 is amended by adding new subsections to read, and then those subsections to read would set these rules regarding establishing a new state tax.
One more question.
All right, Senator Rambo, one more question, and we're going to have to keep moving.
Okay, so basically it's going to say an absolute, and then it's going to modify it at the end. It sounds like to me. I mean, I'm just honestly trying to figure this out, just straight up, because we take an oath to this thing. And I'm not trying to be difficult. I just genuinely want to understand. Sounds like it shall not, but then we're going to. So, anyway.
Hold on a second, Bill. I think Carolyn has an add to that. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, for the record, this is Caroline Schultz from the Office of Management and Budget. If I may, a great example of this implemented in the Constitution currently is in Article 9, Section 7, which is the anti-dedication fund clause. As it was originally drafted, it's prohibited the dedication of state funds. That was amended in 1976 to add except as provided in Section 15, which of course allowed for the creation of the permanent fund.
But I mean, and I don't want to be, yes, I do, and I don't want to be difficult, but, the people did vote on the permanent fund, and they support it, and they support the permanent fund dividend and things like that, but it's still being taken, and that's why I thought Senator Costello's question was really, really good about a taxation with the permanent fund, because a lot of people feel like it is. I can understand both sides of the coin there, but it's just kind of a very, very interesting, it's putting it all together in context in the Constitution, it just causes me pause. That's all. Not that I like taxation, and I'm not sure anybody else does, but some people makes it feels like, you know, taxing makes them feel good because it's like a tithe. You know, a lot of people that may or may not be religious, it makes them feel good, but a lot of people, you know, are barely hanging on and they want to take care of themselves. You know, they're in difficult situations. So anyway, I'm just a little bit.
Well, I'll tell you what, so we can keep this moving, and we still got 3 more pages with a lot of writing on it. Let's see if somebody from the Department of Law, Bill, if you could draft up something that would explain, and again, it sounds like I'm making light of it, but I say the chicken or the egg because it kind of becomes that argument. We're trying to understand it legally. If you could draft up something that would explain it in terms of how it's been done before in the Constitution, as Carolyn brought up a good example in Section 7 from Article 9, that might be helpful to the committee and the public and make it a matter of public record. So it would be explainable that, you know, this is actually something that's acceptable to do and has been done before, to make that clear. Because it does sound like an absolute, and then you're adding something to it. And I can understand the concept of amending it, so then it says what it says. But I think an explanation of that legally might be helpful. Could you do that for the committee?
This is Bill Nelson, Department of Law. Yes, Senator. Yes, Chair Schemmer.
Thank you. And
Quick question.
yeah, Senator Holland.
Totally different topic. And I was just curious, so that's 2 syntaxes that look like were passed in that time period. And just at some point in the future, to get an idea of during that same time period, how many taxes failed as a result of Colorado voters? How many times did they actually cancel what kind of taxes? I'd be interested in that number.
Through the chair, Senator Holland, again, Mike Barnhill for the record. I'm going to have to go back and get that information. I do believe that there were a number of taxes that did fail in Colorado with the voters from 1992 to the present. So happy to do that for any of these states.
Great. If you could provide that with the next committee hearing on the bill, that would be fantastic, or the amendment. Thank you. Okay, let's continue on to the next slide, please.
So just before we go to the next slide, we didn't really cover Missouri and Washington. What I was really trying to show is it's a bit of a mixed bag. In some states, new taxes, increases to taxes have passed. In Missouri, there's a recent example of a tax failing. In Missouri, their constitutional provision is a little more precise. It requires voter approval of any tax increase of $50 million or more, and that has an adjustment for inflation over time. Just recently, there was Proposition D in 2018, which proposed collecting $400 million in increases to gasoline taxes, and that was defeated at the polls. In Washington, they have a constitutional provision which governs local taxes. So this is specifically with respect to real and personal property tax. They call them levy lifts in Washington, very complex tax provisions. There, the local levy lifts have been approved, about 75% of them over recent years. The state I didn't mention was California. California has a constitutional provision which requires general local taxes and special local taxes to be approved by the voters. So more work to do here, Mr. Chair. We'll bring back more specific information.
I'm shocked that you say we would make something in government complicated for the average person to understand. But beyond that, are there any other states besides those 4 that have these enacted? And if so, could you, and I don't need all of the examples, if you could just provide that to the committee, if it's just those 4 or if others have done it as well, please. And continue.
These are the 4 states that I'm aware of. At a local level, I believe there are more examples, but these are the states that have amended their constitution.
Okay, thank you.
And Mr. Chair, moving on to slide 8, the last 3 slides, I appreciate all the conversation discussion so far. And we anticipated this is, it's not a slam dunk. From a policy perspective, there's pros and there's cons. And the National Council of State Legislatures has summarized the experiences of states from a policy perspective. They group what we're looking at in the combined impact of SJR5 and 7, they call that tax and expenditure limitation. And on the last page, I've got a source link that you can click on and see the entire article. Fairly exhaustively categorizes and lists all of the states, the nature of their tax and expenditure limitation, and what the experience has been. And what they try to do is just give legislators like yourselves, policymakers, a fairly lengthy list of pros and cons to consider. I want to make sure we got that to the committee right at the outset. We've sampled a handful here for your consideration. So on the pro side, a tax and expenditure limitation can help make government more accountable and efficient, foster public prioritization of programs and services. And this was a new one I hadn't considered 2 years ago, that in some cases, asking the voters to consent to new taxes may increase tax compliance. And this article is a study of Eastern Bloc European countries post-communism and the use of the referendum to engage voters and improve tax compliance, and they found a relationship there that was positive. On the other hand, on the con side, it is more difficult to raise new revenue. Voters do turn down new taxes and increases the taxes in other states. There can be delay in getting that voter consent while you're waiting for the statewide election. And so that may be an issue for the state of Alaska, particularly when we are at the point of needing new revenue soon. And then the point that Senator Reinbold was making earlier, absolutely fair point, shifts fiscal decision-making away from elected representatives. And then if we turn to pages 9 and 10, that's just a cut and paste from the National Council of State Legislatures webpage. I just put it there for your benefit. You can have your staff click on that link on the bottom of page 10 and see the entire article. But there's a lengthy list of pros and con considerations for policymakers to consider. And with that, Mr. Chair, I will stand down and we can continue the discussion, and I'm available for additional questions.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to get to the end of that, and I'm glad we didn't have to go through all those sentences, so it saves us some time. I don't mind the debate at all. I just wanted to get through it first so we could get to this point. So we can slow down now, and I saw the first finger came up with Senator Kawasaki. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a really quick question. I know, Mr. Barnhill, you were around during the time that we were talking about locking in the price of gas, natural gas, and it was something that the industry really wanted to see, and it was sort of a contingency sort of idea that they did that, or that we did that as a legislature over a number of years, so that they can figure out on the books how their, how the gas line would work in the future. What does SJR7 do to that particular situation in which the legislature might enact a tax? It's agreed to upon by the industry over that period of time, longer period of time, but then it's subject to the whim of the people.
So through the chair, Senator Kawasaki, I believe when you say lock in the price of gas, what you're talking about is locking in the tax rate for a period of years so that you make the economics of a gas line predictable over a longer period of time. My understanding is that the three attorneys general considered this at separate points in time and rendered three separate opinions expressing somewhat different views as to the length of time you could lock in a tax rate. And that's the end of my current understanding of it. And so I'm going to punt it now to Mr. Milks to take it from there. We may need to come back on this question.
Through the chair, Senator Kawasaki, this is Bill Milks at Department of Law. I think your question actually goes to the existing constitutional provision on the taxing power that we were talking about a few minutes ago, which is that power of taxation shall never be surrendered. This power shall not be suspended or contracted away except as provided in this article. So that constitutional provision would still be there. And so then the question becomes, I think, what Mr. Barnhill just identified, which is basically, can you agree to, can you make an agreement in which you would limit future potential for a period of time to adjust the tax? And that would put you right into existing Article 9, Section 1 taxation power. And what did the framers mean when they said it should not be suspended or contracted away? Except, so I think Mr. Barnhill has identified that there's been some prior AG opinions on that. And I guess I would probably join with him. I know Mr. Chair Showers asked us to answer one question. If you want us to delve into that question a little bit, we could include that in a response. But that's a complex issue, which I think has, been accurately identified that we've had different AG Attorney General opinions trying to assess that.
Bill, just to be clear, this is Senator Showers, I would rather have more information than less. So if there's already adjudicated cases or other information you could provide the committee in the responses, I would appreciate it. I think we all would. So I would rather you kind of overdo it than underdo it in this case, because like I said, this is a bit of a rabbit hole, but it's one that might have significant implications, as have already been brought up. And like I said, I think all of us see some potential issues here. So whatever you feel that you can answer with all these questions, even if it's a bit of a rabbit hole, feel free to provide that, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Showers.
Yeah, Senator Reinbold, sorry.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So basically, I have got 3 high-level questions, and I guess I have an escape from the rabbit hole. I mean, if you want to go down the rabbit hole, if you go back up, you can say, well, the power of the people and the power of the people to tax themselves. I can get there, with that leap. But there's definitely responsibility of the legislature too. For example, I'm going to say, so let's just say, and I'm not picking on miners, but I'm just saying, let's just say a statewide tax is for mining or oil or gas or whatever. That's going to, we're going to use the same tax formula for all these, for mining or for gas. Is that actually considered a statewide tax? I mean, it's something that needs to be questioned. And does that mean that we can't do this without a vote of the people? And I mean, let's just start right there.
So, Mr. Chair, Senator Reinbold, Mike Barnhill, for the record, let me just make sure I understand. Are you asking if the legislature enacts a new tax on mining?
It would be a statewide tax on any mining products. Let's just say, isn't that not a statewide tax? And wouldn't this limit us unless we had the approval of the people to do it, and therefore it undermines the representative republic?
Okay, through the chair, Senator Reinbold, I'll just say if it's a new tax on mining products, I would say that is a tax that would be subject to this resolution.
Can I continue?
Continue. I know you had 3 questions. Let's get them
done. Yeah, okay, so the next one is, does this restrain the administration that has 95% of the budget right now? Does this stop them in any way from raising fees or cutting their own budget and being more responsible, or is this just basically a way to, add another step for revenue?
Through the chair, Senator Reinbold, nothing in this resolution does anything with respect to controlling costs or reducing the budget. With respect to raising fees, as we've discussed earlier, state agencies, as long as they have regulatory authority to assess fees, would still be able to assess fees.
And through the chair, one more. Just something that is not settled well for me from the beginning of this hearing is somebody said we're a representative democracy. No, we're a representative republic. So Mr. Bill Milks from Department of Law, can you state clearly what we are? Because this is really important, because we're all down here. The legislature's all down there because we're representative republic, and that has got to be, right on the record, because basically we're not going to need to be here if everything is democracy. I mean, you know where I'm going with this. We need to just get very, very clear on the record of what the administration's stand is if we're a representative democracy or representative republic.
Through the chair, this is Bill Mills, Department of Law. Senator Reinbold, I think what I would explain is I think what Mr. Barnhill previously has. The Alaska Constitution sets out already that both the legislature and the people can enact laws, and they both can repeal laws enacted by either one, the voters through the referendum policy practice. The legislature, after I think a 2-year period, can repeal an initiative law. So I think that's our constitutional framework that exists for the Alaska Constitution. There are some states that don't provide for initiative, and there are states that do provide for the people making laws for initiative, and Alaska is one of those states. So both the legislative branch and the people have the authority to make laws. And so this SJR7, I think as Mr. Barnhill has been testifying to, is essentially following that model.
And Bill, this is Senator Schauer. Just to be clear, for an answer for the record, because Senator Reinbold asked it, she did ask if you could define if we are a democracy or a representative republic, and not trying to put you on the spot, but just based on your knowledge of the law, could you, to the best of your ability, answer that question, just so it's done?
Well, through again, Bill Nelson, Department of Law. Without repeating myself too much here, we have a form of representative government through having a legislative branch, which is consistent with the United States, other states, the United States government. But we also have a direct democracy component, which is what Mr. Barnhill has explained, which is the power to enact laws through initiative. So we have a blending of laws are being made through a representative republic model as well as a direct democracy model. And I think if we look at Article 1 of the Alaska Constitution, Section 2, it identifies the source of government. So we can review that. So that's how I would answer that question, Chair Schauer.
Thank you. That's probably why I'm not a lawyer. I tend to be more direct. It's a tough one. I get it, and I understand what you're trying to say. So thanks for trying to answer that one. I'm going to go to Senator Kawasaki, and then we'll go back to Senator Reinbold.
Sure.
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Mike.
Mike Barnhill. If I could just add a quick addition, and this may get to Senator Reinbold's question. So if we turn to the United States Constitution in Article 4, Section 4, I'll just quote, "The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government." And so by the U.S. Constitution, every state must have a Republican form of government. There's multiple ways of phrasing that. You can call it a representative democracy. You can call it a representative republic. Both of those terms, in my mind, are synonymous. But here's the important part. Multiple states have added direct democracy features to their constitutions, and that's been going on now for at least 100 years. And those additions have never been found to be a violation of the guarantee of Republican form of government as required under the U.S. Constitution.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. I'm not trying to split hairs here. I'm just trying to, one, make sure that Senator Reinbold's question was more directly answered, and two, I don't mind the discussion because we are talking about constitutional issues and taxation right out of the Constitution, so it is appropriate to dive deeper. It's part of what we should be doing here. So I just want to kind of keep us on a little bit of a track so we get the questions answered and go to the next one. So we're going to go on back to Senator Kawasaki, please.
Yeah, just a really brief question. This in Section 2 of the bill dealing with the establishment of a state tax, is that also to include modifying an existing tax. So like the mining license tax, which was created in 1959, there was a measure several years ago to change the tiers, the progressivity in each of those different tiers. Would that also be included under this amendment to the Constitution?
Through the chair, Senator Kawasaki, the short answer is no. Under last legislature's SJR4, that was more of an open question. But here the language is, that establishes a state tax, quote, that establishes a state tax, end quote. So if the tax in question is already established, but we're simply modifying it, that will not be covered.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So currently we have existing taxes. We have a fish tax. It's a progressive percentage. We have a mining license tax with progressivity built in based on the amount of profit per. There's 4 tiers and based on profit. So you're saying that changing those percentages would not constitute establishment of a new tax, or it would not be included in this Article 9, Section 2 or 1B.
Through the chair, correct.
Is another way of saying that as well as not retroactive, so we're not going to take this backwards if it was enacted on certain things and change them? And what I mean by that is the question I asked previously, that if this is enacted, is there the possibility of it being interpreted that it could apply to more things than we intend? Unintended consequences is basically what I'm asking. And it's kind of a follow-up to Senator Kawasaki's question, maybe phrased slightly differently.
Mr. Chair, I think the intention here is to narrow it from what we had 2 years ago in SJR4 and eliminate some of these questions. So it clearly just applies to a new tax.
Okay. That'd be something we want to ask. We get another opinion on, just for the safety. So back to Senator Reinbold.
Okay, so back to the republic versus democracy. We are a representative republic, so I actually have a constitutional expert coming before judiciary next week, and I'm going to make sure I get that clearly on the record. We are not a democracy. Anyway, in regards to, let's get back to the bill. SJR7, this section, it's Section 2 under C. It says a law enacted by the voters through the initiative process under Article 11 that establishes a state tax shall not take effect unless the legislature, by resolution, approves it by majority vote. So basically, this, the people have a lot of work that goes into initiatives. I've certainly worked initiatives before, but to me, this even I don't even like some of the initiatives that have passed, but the fact is that they've passed. And now this basically undermines the will of the voters that put that initiative in place. So now we're switching, what some of the voters have, and then if we don't support it with the majority vote in a joint session, then it says it's rejected and it does not become effective. So I guess I just have a real problem with this, with Section 2. Mr. Chairman, I don't even know who to ask the question to, but that just seems kind of like a slap in the face to the people.
I think that's more of a statement than a question. I'm not sure anybody can really answer that one because it's based on your subjective opinion, which is fine. But we need to express those. But if somebody wants to take a stab at answering that, but I think it was more of a comment than a question. Unless somebody has one they want to throw out there, they're welcome to.
So, Mr. Chair, Mike Barnhill again, and with deep respect for every member of the committee, and I appreciate all of these questions. I really think it's important to get to all of them. But I think Senator Reinbold, to the extent that you're very concerned about the initiative, the direct democracy taking away from elements of a representative republic, then this Section C, I think, actually helps your concern. because it essentially restores that legislative power with respect to initiated taxes.
Okay, Senator Ramble, follow up.
Okay. So yes and no. I understand the angle that you're taking, but the Constitution does allow for the people to have a say through the initiative process, and then if we can kill that, in the legislature, that undermines the initiative place in the Constitution. So, to me, once again, this looks like a double in the same area. It's where you can't tax and you can tax. Well, you can do initiative, but you can't really because the legislature can kill it. It's just, to me, I don't know. This is not transparent government to me, and it causes me pause.
Fair enough, and I will tell you, frankly, I have some of the same concerns, more from the ability of the legislature to basically override the will of the people. I would add, if we consider this closely, that it's not that the legislature can't act, we're just prevented for some amount of time of acting upon it. We absolutely can act later, and I believe it's about 2 years, but I don't want to get that wrong in front of the public, where we can come back and we can repeal and do other things to a bill if it doesn't work, etc. So we still have recourse. It's not as if this didn't pass, so we wouldn't be able to do that as a legislature if something did not work out, based on any number of factors. So there are some checks and balances still through this, things that I think we need to consider. I'll ask if anybody's got 1 minute or less, so we're out of here on time. Questions from the committee? Anybody else at the end of the day? It's been one of these longer, more tougher ones to sit through and listen, so thanks for everybody's patience. We need to dive on this pretty hard because this does affect our Constitution, and that should never be taken lightly. So thank you to Mike and Bill and Carolyn for coming and presenting. I know we're going to see some of you over the next few weeks again with the PFD coming up, and we will certainly get back into that as we finish up for the day. So to get us back on script, thank you for the presenters. You guys are cleared off if you want to leave, or you can wait for the next 60 seconds. Our State Affairs next State Affairs Committee meeting will be on this Tuesday, February 9th at 3:30 p.m. We're going to hear SB53 Permanent Fund Advisory Vote and SJR6 Constitutional Amendment Permanent Fund and PFDs. We might bring up other bills, but that's just for now. Seeing no further business in front of the committee, this time we're going to go ahead and adjourn at 4:59. Have a good night.
Wow, what a day, what a day. Give me just a second here. I'm going to do my little recap as always. Okay, definitely been a very interesting day today. We had SB56 earlier today that they were talking about. If you missed the finance meeting this morning, I was out working. I was not able to live stream it, but I was able to listen to it as I was out there on the job. And they were 100% talking about the future of our permanent fund dividend, talking with the Permanent Fund Dividend Corporation, and discussing about how much money is in there, this $75 billion. And the unrealized gains, and then $71 billion if you take into account the $3 billion they took and the unrealized gains. So it's kind of one of those little funny games that they play with the numbers, but there's $75 billion sitting there. Today's discussions were about different constitutional amendments giving us the right as Alaskans to be able to vote on any new tax that may be happening with it. Give us the right to put our permanent fund dividend within the statutory PFD, whatever formula we can agree upon, which I am all for the original statutory PFD and getting rid of SB 26, completely getting that out of the picture. They don't need an extra POMV draw from the permanent fund dividend, which is where they get their fake cap that says we only can get $1,000. PFD, I mean, that's what they're pushing again this year. Don't be surprised, it's $1,000. That's all they are willing to give us. This is coming from out of the Senate. So this is the guys that have not joined any binding caucus. This is the message that is coming out of them. whether that be coming from the Democrats or that be coming from the Republicans. I'm hearing a mix of both. No discussions about cutting the budget anywhere that I have heard so far. It has all been status quo and all about how to use the permanent fund dividend and give us a permanent fund dividend at the same time. No talk of giving us our statutory PFD or returning any of the money that they have taken from us in previous years, like a stimulus check, so to speak. But it's just returning what they've stolen, the extra $2,000 that the governor has requested in his thing this year. So very interesting discussions listening to the SJR bills 5, 6, and 7. And I'm not sure SB53 was listed there, other than that may be an encompassing of all of these. Might be the reason behind that other bill number, but I heard nothing about that. But in other words, it was a very interesting day. A lot of things in there about our constitutional rights. So this is very important to be liking, sharing, making sure other Alaskans are on top of what is going on with these bills. They started back in 2018, the first year governor took office. These were his constitutional amendments that he presented to them all. Thanks to the illegal binding caucus and the Democrat rhinos being in control, the 5 or 6 in both the House and the Senate, that literally just, they dictated, you sold your vote before the final bills come out, and no matter what's in them, you were an automatic yes. And the Senate has promised us that they have not formed no caucuses this year. Nobody has sold our voices or votes away into the illegal binding caucus rule. And but that is waiting to be seen. The House today has completely semi-organized. They've got their pro tem finally, 2.5 weeks later, and they finally got a pro tem in there. It is a gentleman from the northern region of Alaska. That's all I can remember at the moment about who he is. He's a freshman this year, and so we got a pro tem freshman that is there. A lot of questions out there I'm seeing from people. He is an independent. He openly has stated that he is not not sure if he's really for a binding caucus, but he is on record for saying that he is a part of the rural Alaskan caucus. I would be the best way to describe that. So, if they live in rural Alaska, that is the caucus he caucuses for. So you can take that any way you would like. But again, don't forget to like and share. These are our constitutional amendments. These are very important that all Alaskans get actively involved, paying attention to what's going on. This is what's going to definitely affect future generations and what happens, whether or not they can impose a state income tax with or without our approval. Things like that, different things that need to be, Alaskans need to be allowed to have a choice and a vote in the matter. Same thing like with our permanent fund dividend. We should be allowed to have a vote on what the future of our PFD is, not be dictated and watch it being systematically eroded and stolen away. I'm going to give a quick comparison. You can call me whatever you like after this. I don't really care. Most people are going to sit there and say, how dare you say that? But I'm going to point out for all of you that are a part of the land allotments that were given out during the 1970s to the different organizations here in Alaska. It is, this is, mind you, this is just a comparison. This is not really happening. But you shareholders out there that get your corporate dividend every single year from these different organizations for owning the land here in Alaska, and the money that was given to all of you and the shares of the money that you get to receive from you every year this year, you're not getting your checks. I'm sorry to inform you, us as the corporate board, the 6 that are in charge of whatever, I just giving you a fictitious number here of how many are actually in charge, but the 6 people have decided that they can use your money that is rightfully yours as a shareholder and go use it anywhere else that they feel fit, that they think needs it. That money needs to go more than you need it in your own pocket for the land that you own, for the rights of who you are. and you no longer deserve it to have it anymore. That is no different than what is happening with our permanent fund dividend right now, just so the people have a comparison. Our permanent fund dividend, we Alaskans are the shareholders of everything that is in that side of that corporation. This is no different than if I was to say the shareholders of the allotment of the lands that have been receiving it now for decades and a couple of generations at this point, that you guys are no longer allowed to get your money. That is no different than what they're saying to us Alaskans. We gave up our minimal rights to become the 49th state of Alaska back in 1959. And as a compact agreement that was made breaking in 1976 in Alaska is when they first decided to stick the money back into and form the Permanent Fund Dividend Corporation. In 1982, we received our first PFDs. That law has been a statutory law, and it was up until 6 years ago when Governor Walker used his veto power and stole half of our PFDs through an executive order. And the court system, when he got sued for doing that, the court system said that the shall was not a shall, it's now a may. This is not an appropriation, this is a transfer, not a transfer, but this is an appropriation. This puts it in the power of the purse strings of legislators. And then history was made after that as we watched our legislators now have control of the purse strings of our Permanent Fund Dividend Corporation and all $75 billion that's inside of it. The formula that was set up over 4 decades ago now at this point has been completely ignored. If they had been following the formula since day one and they had been investing the money properly, our Permanent Fund Dividend currently right this year would have been another $3,000. With the record-breaking stock markets that we've had here the last 4 years, and I would be seeing it, to be all honesty, I do not understand. We should be seeing somewhere around $3,500, $4,000, $5,000 here in about 5 years, based upon, especially if these earnings stay up where they are right now. But I don't see that happening under the Biden administration. I see the stock market's going to have some serious crashes to where it's going to drop down to more normal levels pre-Trump. They won't go as low as that, but they are going to drop down quite dramatically is my prediction. So we got our Permanent Fund Dividend Corporation out there, $75 billion sitting in it. $6 billion is what they said they would have to pull out just to be able to pay us a $5,000 PFD. They're lying to us. They're lying to all of us. Each $1,000 is roughly around $600 million. So you'd multiply that by 3 to get $3,000. And that's only 1 point, $1.8 billion is all that comes out to be. So we're looking at $3.6 billion, actually less than that if they were to give us just a $5,000 PFD. So as you can see, don't believe the myths. It's not $6 billion they would have to pull out. It's not $10 billion they would have to pull out. They want to lump in what they want to steal to pay for the budget on top of what they pull out of our PFDs. Now, they did steal $3.1 billion last year from the ERA to pay for government's expenses and gave us $600 million. And they paid that using tax revenue. They did not use the money from the ERA that they appropriated because they didn't do the statutory transfer over from the ERA to pay us our permanent fund dividends. I'm going to wrap this up. Don't forget to like and share. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Again, make sure you share this. Alaskans need to hear about these constitutional amendments that they're talking about. It affects the future of our children, our generations to come. Really important. Taxes, permanent fund, the works, making it constitutional, making it laws so that it protects all of our rights, and gives Alaskans the chance to be able to have a voice and an opinion by allowing us to vote when it comes time to it, so that we don't get ramrodded by 60 people sitting in Juneau deciding how 730,000 people are going to pay the price for their decisions without a voice in the matter, which is the way things are right now. Go to my website, Politadick.com, click that support button, and make a donation today. All proceeds go back to making sure that I can keep up with the latest and greatest Alaskan news. I'm usually more informed than what I am putting onto my posts, but if you watch my videos, especially the endings of them, you get a lot more information than you'd ever see anywhere else. I'm getting ready to put out a big flood of old information, but it's still current information, because it's the reason why I've been sharing it all since day one, is because it keeps repeating, and it's another repeat over and over and over again, year after year, the same stuff. They just call it a different name and try to resell you the same bad policies and same bad packages. They just try to put it in a brand new wrapping and put a pretty new looking bow on top of it and say, looky, looky, looky what we have here, when they're really just selling you the bag of manure that they just put into a different box and put a bow on top of it. So anyways, go to the website, Politadick.com, make a donation. I love exposing what they don't want us to see. Unless you have gavel, unless you got the time to go and sit and watch on Alaska Legis site all day long, that's the only place you're going to see that. Here on Facebook, it gives you a chance to do your normal surfing while watching the video, which always makes it well worthwhile doing. That way you can do two things at once and not just be stuck in one place the entire time. All you guys have a great afternoon, and I will see you, I'm sure, probably tomorrow. Bye.